Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a podcast from PJTN that focuses the light of truth on vital issues in today's headlines that impact every American. I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza Moore, founder and president of Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, and I'm here to educate, motivate, and activate you to action. I want to arm you with the truth and the facts you'll need to fight and preserve our constitutional republic and uphold the Judeo-Christian values our nation was founded upon. Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a PJTN podcast where we shine the light of biblical truth on vital issues from today's headlines that impact every American, Jew and Christian, people of faith, and people of conscience. I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza Moore. If you missed the last episode of this podcast, you will find it and our previous podcast lineup on our website at pjtn.org, as well as all the other platforms that you use to access your favorite podcasts. On this week's podcast, we will continue our conversation on the history of the cancel culture movement and why Roman Catholics of Spain and Portugal persecuted the Sephardi Jews, and how that relates to the Greco-Roman cancel culture of the 2nd century. I also want to remind you that it's important for you to listen and share this and all of our previous podcasts with your family and friends so that they can become more informed about this and other related issues that threaten our republic and the state of Israel. So please remember to like and share. Yaffah, welcome back to PJTN's Proclaiming Justice podcast. You know, the Bible says there's nothing new under the sun, and unfortunately, our kids don't know that because we don't teach them an accurate perspective of history. And today, on today's show, I want to talk to you about the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisition and the secret Jews. And of course, this information that we're going to be sharing and talking about today for our listeners is part of a book that Yaffah is writing and should have completed very soon. And of course, I'm looking forward to it because it's a topic that's very near and dear to my heart with my family background. And so Yaffah, you've mentioned before, and we've talked about this, about the lack of education of our children. And I think it would be safe to say, not just here in the United States, but Western nations and even Israel, that we don't talk much. We don't teach our children about the Spanish Inquisition and the Portuguese Inquisition. We may get a little blurb of it when the kids learn about Columbus in their textbooks, but it's far from an in-depth understanding or teaching about what actually happened. Why did Columbus leave Spain, and why was he seeking out the New World? Of course, we know that ties right back into the Inquisition. So Yaffah, welcome back. Let's talk about this issue, which is so important, and I think very important and relevant to our audience as well.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me again. I really enjoyed doing this show with you. And, this topic is near and dear to both of us, since we both have this ancestry of the Sephardi Jews in our family. And, every once in a while, I'll see on social media someone asking if Columbus was a crypto Jew or a secret Jew or whatever term they use, or proposing that he was, and other people, jumping on and saying, well, no, he wasn't. There's no evidence. So I see that periodically, but that's pretty much all I see on social media about this topic. And it's really quite sad, and it's also very unfortunate. But what happened was the Holocaust, which was only 75, 80 years ago, was so traumatic, with so many people being killed in such a short period of time. It was like 4 or 5 years, in that range. And it was genocide, okay? And it was during World War II. I mean, there were many, many millions of people who died.
Right.
I did a chapter already on World War II. They say there was like 60 to 80 million people worldwide who died, which includes the people who were slaughtered by the Nazis. Okay.
Mm.
So the trauma of all of that was so great that it totally overshadowed all the stories of the killing fields of the Inquisitions, even though it lasted over 300 years, because the
Mhm.
numbers of people that were burnt at the stake, which was a terrible, horrible, very excruciating thing to suffer, okay?
Right.
But the numbers were a lot less, and it
Mhm.
spanned out over the 300 years, okay?
Mhm.
So it was just totally overshadowed by the Shoah. In Hebrew, we call it the Shoah, or people call it the Holocaust. So after World War II, there was a very large effort, and thank God, I don't object that there was such an effort to teach about the horrors of war and genocide and build museums and learning centers and all the things that were done because of, what happened with what the
Right.
Nazis did. I don't object to that at all. I think it's great, but I'm really disappointed that at least some of these museums could have maybe connected the dots back to
Mhm.
some of the things that were done in the Inquisition, which they didn't do. And the
Mhm.
Nazis looked into that. The Nazis actually sent someone, I forget who, I have to look it up, to Spain to look at Inquisition records to see what they had done.
Mhm.
Okay. And they did some of the same things, like making people identify themselves in their clothing, wearing some kind of course, with the Nazis, it was the yellow star. But
Right.
Spain also did that. And it even went beyond Spain, even before that in the Middle Ages. So there were things that were a continuation of what had happened before. And that wasn't even called out in some of the museums. So I'd like to see that changed. But there are two museums about the Inquisition. One that I know about in El Paso, Texas, okay, and the other one is
Interesting.
somewhere in Latin America, which I forget where, but there are at least two, and maybe there's others that I'm not even aware of. But the point is that the Jews of Spain, and I'll talk about Portugal in a minute. The
Mhm.
Jews of Spain had an on again, off again good relations with the Muslim rulers in southern Spain before the rulers of Castile and Aragon got together, the famous, Ferdinand and Isabella, when they
Mhm.
married each other, they merged those two regions of northern Spain. But in the south was ruled by the Muslims. And in those days, Muslims and Jews and Christians got along pretty good
Mhm.
because of the concept of tolerance in these Muslim ruled communities of southern Spain. But then what happened was there was a massacre in Granada in 1066 of the Common Era under the Muslims. And so after that, many of the Jews went to live in northern provinces where it was strictly Roman Catholic rule.
Mhm.
Okay. And that was a massacre, first of its time in the 8th century, where the Jews were being persecuted under Muslim rule. Okay. And again, these persecutions are just because they were Jews.
Right.
So after that massacre in Granada, okay, some of them started migrating north, more into the Catholic rural areas. Okay, the governments tried to protect the Jews, even the crown tried to protect the Jews. But there's a story about this archdeacon, of course, a Christian, in a place called Echija, who spoke very vile and extreme sermons against the Jews, and for
Mm.
many years. And he was warned quite a few times to stop it, and he refused to stop it, okay, giving such vile sermons against the Jews. And again, it always goes back to this charge of deicide that Jews were said to be the ones who had killed Christ, okay?
Right.
Always. And there are other
Mm.
things that are, and in the Middle Ages, you had the Jews being blamed for the Black Plague, and you had the blood libels, which I have a whole chapter on the Middle Ages too. But
Mhm.
the thing is, ultimately and bottom line, the thing that really upset the Christians the most was this charge, this accusation, okay, that Jews had killed them, and when it really was the Romans. But you see, and I know you know this, in the Middle Ages, people didn't have access to these writings of the first century.
Right.
They learned from the priests and the monks
Mhm.
and the abbots and whatever. Okay. And of course, they could teach them whatever they wanted. And then if you had a guy like that one who had such vitriolic, sermons against the Jews, hate, against the Jews, encouraging people, inciting people to actually go out and get rid of them, kill them, convert them, or kill them. That's what he preached, okay? That they had to be converted to Christianity, even if by force. And he whipped up the populations in that area so much that in June of 1391, there was a major massacre of about 4,000 Jews in Seville. And the rest of the Jews in Seville were so terrified, they accepted to be converted, okay? And then within less than a year of that 1391 massacre, I'm sorry, not less than a year, less than 100 years rather, sorry, just short of 100 years later, you have the expulsion of the remaining Jews of Castile and Aragon, being told that they had to leave the country. And why was that? Because the king and queen of Spain, there were so many conversos, which simply means converted. There were so many new Christians, that's also what they were called. They were afraid the Jews who were still in Spain, who were also still Jews, okay, still observant Jews, would try to influence these converso Jews to revert back to Judaism. So that's what caused the expulsion, okay? And then after that, we get into the Inquisitions. It's really, they were so fearful of the Jews that they had to kill them.
Yeah, this is something that a lot of Christians are not familiar with. And if we look throughout history for the last 2,000 years, the attacks and the persecution of the Jews generally came out of the Christian community. Now, yes, you did bring up about the Muslims who had massacred the Jews as well. But for the most part, the pogroms, during the pogroms, it was the Christians who blamed the Jews. During of course, the Inquisition, the Holocaust. But we see this root of anti-Semitism. It passes on from generation to generation. We can go back even further, before 2,000 years, to the time of Pharaoh in Egypt, when, there arose a people that were numerous. And of course, that, the Egyptians had forgotten about Joseph. We know from the Bible, the account of the Bible. But there was also Haman in Persia. So there's always been attempts since God made this covenant with Abraham to annihilate the Jews. And I believe it is out of jealousy. And of course, with the Inquisition and the fact that we don't pass this on to the generations well, just like what you said, there's 2 museums that you know of. Are there museums you didn't mention? You mentioned El Paso, Texas, which I find extremely interesting. Why El Paso, and then a Latin country, a Latin American country? Why not Spain and Portugal? I mean, didn't Spain and Portugal recently, over the last 5 years, open up their borders to those Jews who were forced to flee the Inquisition in Spain and Portugal? I would find it interesting as to why they would not have a museum that tells this part of Spanish and Portuguese history.
Well, maybe they will someday, but the opening of the borders to descendants of Sephardi Jews who were expelled or forcibly converted, okay, was simply because they wanted Jewish money. They wanted people to come and live in those countries. And yes, they offered them citizenship, but they wanted their money. They wanted to increase the economic situation of Spain and Portugal, which after the Inquisitions, okay, and after all the power and control that they had over the New World, okay, because the New World, aside from the United States, which the people came from Europe and Great Britain and Scandinavia, whatever, the rest of the New World, the Caribbean and Central America, South America, was all Spanish and Portuguese. So after that, and the 300 years of Inquisition that went to the New World, because it followed them there, okay, after that, Spain and Portugal went down. They went very, very down economically. And so the thing is, it does go back to jealousy. Of course, there's no justification for killing another human being. We know that from God's law, even for non-Jews. Okay, but the thing is, this envy and jealousy, to be honest, goes all the way back to Jacob and Esau. If you really want to know where it
Mm.
originated first, okay?
Right.
Now, you
Mm-hmm.
know the story, I'm sure even many Christians know this story about the sale of the birthright.
Mm-hmm.
It was legitimate, it was lawful, and it was legal.
Mm-hmm.
Esau, comes back from hunting and he's tired and he's hungry, he's famished. Now, Jacob is making this lentil stew, which is a mourner's meal. And the commentary says that they were mourning the death of Abraham that day. He had died,
Mm-hmm.
and his son Isaac now was responsible for the burial. But because he would be handling a corpse, okay, in the burial rites, he couldn't offer sacrifice. He was now the head of the family, and at that time, the head of each family offered the daily sacrifice. And so
Mm-hmm.
Isaac couldn't do it. So it was going to fall to Esau, who was the firstborn. And he even says, what do I care? I'm going to die anyway. Well, the commentary says he knew he was going to die because if he was so evil that if he tried to offer that sacrifice, he would die. He would be killed.
Mm-hmm.
So he voluntarily sold the birthright because he didn't want to offer the sacrifice. So in selling the birthright, Yaakov or Jacob was now the head of the family for that day because it would revert back to Isaac after the
Mm-hmm.
burial of Abraham. So the birthright gets sold. Okay, some people think, well, for a bowl of lentils, why did he sell it? And why did Jacob want it? Jacob wanted it so that he would have the legitimate authority to offer the sacrifice that day. But later, what
Mm.
happened is Esau told a lie that's continued on down through the ages that Jacob stole the birthright.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay? And that lie, and as a result of envy and jealousy, okay, has come down through the ages. I mean, Laban was wicked.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Jacob goes to live in that area, to find a wife and everything, and he marries Leah and Rachel. But Laban, his father in law, okay, changed his salary, changed his wages many times because he thought, well, this guy's a crook. I can be a crook too. Why did he think
Mm-hmm.
Jacob was a crook? Because in the family, it was said that he had stolen Esau's birthright, the right of the firstborn, and he didn't steal it at all. So, and it carries on from there of lies that have been told about the descendants of Jacob now, the
Mm-hmm.
Israelites, okay, go into Egypt, as you know, and then later, of
Mm-hmm.
course, we have the 12 tribes and everything else. So these lies about, and even today's day, the Jews, okay, it all goes back to that. It's phenomenal.
Mm.
There shouldn't be the lies to begin with, much less kill people or cause them to be persecuted
Mm-hmm.
or damaged and wounded and all the other stuff that's been going on all these years, including today. It shouldn't
Right.
happen. It's all based on lies.
Right. Well, also, Esau is also Edom. And there are several scriptures by the prophets that talk about in the last days that, like, for example, Obadiah, that in the last days, Hashem is going to wipe out the descendants of Edom because they stood by while their brother Jacob was held in captivity and they did nothing. And if you think back historically of how people, especially particularly Christians, stood by during the Inquisition, during the pogroms, during the Holocaust, it makes you wonder, is the Christian church Edom?
Well, the rabbis think so. Actually, they say it's Western civilization. It's more than just Christianity, although Christianity is mainly in Western civilization. But
Correct.
what happened was there was a little tiny town in the peninsula called Italy named Rome, and a grandson of Esau named Zepho, Tzepho, went, long story, but he went and became the king
Mm-hmm.
of Rome and brought obviously some of his others extended family Okay. And that's why they say Rome is Edom, Edom is Rome, and of course you had the Roman Empire, which
Mm-hmm.
persecuted the Jews, and then you had what the Romans did to the first century writings, which we've talked about in other podcasts. Okay, so they really hurt the Jews a lot as well, and not just the Jews, the God-fearers. Okay, the people who are coming to understand that there's not all these multiple pagan gods who are fighting with each other and all this other stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and the emperors who, when they die, were called gods, and then their son was called the Son of God. It's an interesting thing that happened there, where the Galilean was called Son of God because it's a title of the Messiah, and they believed he was the Jewish Messiah in that day. It was an apocalyptic time for them. They
Mm-hmm.
thought, because the Roman occupation of Judea was so severe and so brutal, that they must be living, okay, at the end of
Mm-hmm.
days. Okay, and we see what's going on today. A lot of people think we're
Right.
living in the end of days,
Yeah.
right? But they thought that in the first century. So, Son of God was a title of the King of Israel. And that's why the Romans tacked that plaque on the cross saying the King of the
Mm-hmm.
Jews. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what they thought. Okay. And it was apocalyptic times. Apocalypse simply means disclosed or revealed. It's a Greek word. But the thing is, it wasn't time for that. It apparently
Mm-hmm.
wasn't that time when all of these prophecies in the Hebrew Bible would be fulfilled. Now, there was that time when he was hung on the cross, but then almost 40 years later, sometime 37, 40 years in that range, you have the destruction of the temple. Now, Paul's writings, people, if they really want to understand the first century writings, this is a critical part of context. Paul's writings were all done before the destruction of the temple, 50 and 60 of the Common Era. And then he's killed in Rome.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The temple was destroyed in 70 of the Common Era. And that's when all the Gospels and everything else was written. Well, Paul's letters were written too. But,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a big difference between those two, because what happens with the Gospels, with these narrative stories about his life, okay, is that they were writing these things, they were copying them and sending them out and distributing them within the Roman Empire, and they had to be careful of what part of cancel culture did they have to be careful of,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
Censorship.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Censorship and propaganda,
Right.
okay, was very strong in the Roman Empire against anything that the Romans thought could be, something that could threaten the empire. So
Exactly.
it's a literary device in the Gospels that says it goes before Pontius Pilate, right? And Pontius Pilate, this very, you know, honorable man, so to speak, not according to Josephus. But anyway, he says, well, this man is innocent. And his wife tells him she had a dream. This man is innocent. He washes his hands of his blood.
Mm-hmm.
But what he didn't do is he didn't say to the Jews in the mob there that were calling for his death, he didn't say, well, you know what? You go take him and kill him according to your own law. You know why?
Mm-hmm.
Because they couldn't, because the Romans were in power, they were occupying Judea, and a person could only be killed under Roman law. And for an offense rather, that the Romans decided the death penalty was going to be the price they would pay. And of course, if the person is saying something and doing something that's treasonous against the Roman Empire, that's definitely the death sentence for that.
Right.
And he didn't claim to be the king of the
Mm-hmm.
Jews. Other people claimed. He stands
Mm-hmm.
before Pontius Pilate, mute, doesn't say a
Mm-hmm.
word, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And you read the text, he never claims to be the king of the Jews.
Right. Even Pontius Pilate, his response was quite telling that he heard all the arguments and he washed his hands of it.
Right. But again, that's a literary device to blame the Jews, okay?
Mm.
Because the
Mm.
Jews were the ones calling for his death, allegedly, according to
Right.
that document. But in reality, according to Josephus, which is outside of the canon of the Bible, Josephus writes that this man was a vicious, violent governor and was called back to Rome because he was so violent and so vicious that they took him out of his position. Now,
Mm.
how do those two stories jive? They don't. Those two images of Pontius Pilate don't jive. Okay. So what some people, and I'm one of them, thinks is they put that into that document of that gospel, okay, so that the Jews would be blamed for his death, even though after he appears before Pontius Pilate and the
Right.
washing of his hand and all that, it says the Romans then took him to go and flog him and put him up on a Roman execution cross. Okay. It clearly says the Romans killed him. Well, they could only have killed him if Pontius Pilate had ordered it. So the real people who killed him were the Romans, not the Jews. And this thing of putting in the mouth of the people of the mob, well, his blood be on us and on our children, okay, is the device, a literary device used to have the Jews blamed for his death rather than the Romans.
So this is an interesting perspective, because I haven't heard it, or I've not seen it presented this way in any of the writings that I have read over the years in studying this issue, of course, studying the Bible. But I'm very familiar with the term. And you bring up a very important point, that the only way the Romans would have taken his life or killed him was if he was in violation of Roman law. And otherwise, if Pontius Pilate really did wash his hands of this situation, then what he should have done was released Yeshua to the religious leaders, the Jewish religious leaders. But that didn't happen, because had he been released, the form according to the Torah, if anyone was to violate specific laws, especially what Yeshua was being accused of, then it would be stoning. That was the form of justice that was executed to someone who violated the Torah. So correct me if I'm wrong, but this is an interesting way to present this information.
The thing is that it was hearsay that Pontius Pilate relied upon to give the death sentence to him. And hearsay is never allowed in court. That person who was accused of treason against Rome had to have declared himself to be the King of the Jews, the Messiah, whatever you want to call him, both in front of Caiaphas, the high priest, which he didn't do. He didn't say it in front of Caiaphas. Asked him. He didn't answer the question. Same thing with Pontius Pilate. He stood mute. He didn't even talk to him at all. Okay. So it was simply hearsay. Somebody said, told somebody, okay, that, and maybe they believed it, of course, he must be the Messiah. Okay. And King Messiah is from the Davidic line. Okay. So obviously he wasn't that. There are certain things the Davidic Messiah has to do, Mashiach ben David. And those things didn't happen. So he wasn't. Now, I know the Christians believe he'll come back and do all of that. And that's fine. By the way, what people believe in their own faith walk, in their own relationship with the Creator is fine. There's no problem with any of that. The problem is the persecution of the Jews for not going along with it. And even today, those Christians who are still out to convert the Jews because they think the Jews are holding up the show, as Tovia Singer likes to say, and unless the Jews are converted, okay, and believe in him as the Messiah. But here's the bottom line. Here's the most important thing I can say about that. The concept of salvation, Paul says very clearly in the beginning of Romans, salvation comes from God. Right. He's talking about the Creator. Second of all, the concept of Messiah, Mashiach, in the Hebrew, that concept and the concept of salvation is not in any verse of the Hebrew Bible, not one. In other words, there's no connection, there's no correlation, there's nothing. Those dots don't connect.
Interesting.
So the church for years persecuted the Jews for not wanting to believe that he was the Messiah. But wait a minute, the speculation, and that's all it is, about who will be King Messiah even today, people can speculate it's Moshe Rabbeinu,
Mm-hmm.
resurrected, or the Galilean resurrected, or Shabbatai Tzvi, or Bar Chachma, who was claiming to be Mashiach in 135 of the Common Era, and Akiva, Rabbi
Mm-hmm.
Akiva, a very famous rabbi, believed in him until he died. Okay, so, or the Rebbe, Rabbi Shearson. So there are all these people who either claim to be Mashiach, the king, or people thought that he was, and then he dies, however he died, and so obviously he wasn't the one. But the
Mm-hmm.
speculation of who it will be is fine. Anybody can speculate about that, but it's not a matter of salvation. That's
Mm-hmm.
the bottom line. Paul says salvation comes from God.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And it has to do with righteousness. It has to do with fulfilling God's will. So here you have the Jews all these years trying to fulfill God's will by observing the Torah, which was given at Mount Sinai for
Mm-hmm.
Israel. Okay. Here you have them doing the best they can in spite of all this persecution, inquisitions, all the stuff that's been going, the massacres, the
Right.
Holocaust. You have these Jewish people who've been trying to do this all this time, and all they've wanted was to be left in peace, to worship the Creator the way He told them to, okay, at
Mm-hmm.
Har Sinai. They don't go out trying to convert Christians to becoming
Mm-hmm.
Jews, because
Mm-hmm.
according to Judaism, all the righteous of the world have a place in the world to come. Whether they're
Mm-hmm.
non-Jewish, whether they're Jewish, doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Righteousness is the key for salvation. That's all throughout the Hebrew Bible. And again,
Mm-hmm.
we don't mean perfect righteousness. We mean people who are attempting every day to live a righteous, honorable
Right.
life according to God's will. So that's the bottom line here, is that those two concepts don't ever intersect in the Hebrew Bible. But
Mm-hmm.
that's what the Romans did when they changed it. They said, first of all, this is a brand new covenant. It's only now for the non-Jews. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
apply to Jews anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. When Paul was quoting Jeremiah 31, which definitely says he's talking about Israel. Okay.
Right.
So they changed that, and there's all kinds of other stuff they changed, and then persecute the Jews for millennia for not wanting to go along and have the freedom of religion that, I mean, everybody today should have the freedom of religion, including the Jewish
Mm-hmm.
people.
Well, this is, as always, fascinating and very interesting to hear this perspective. And it's not one that I know is familiar to many Christians, because this is not taught. And, you know, we have to, one of the rules that I have in my Bible study with my students is to always remember, as we study the New Testament, that we need to find the cloud of 2 to 3 witnesses to testify to a matter. And that is biblical. And if we cannot find it, then we have to ask ourselves, what has been added, what has been taken away. Um, this is always a huge concern, because there is nothing new under the sun. And you raise a lot of interesting questions, very thought-provoking, Yaffah, and things that, as Christians, they should be considered, because this is what continues to perpetuate the hatred against the Jews throughout history, even today. This is what we're witnessing happen as well. We see I am publicly speaking more and more on the issue of our biblical responsibility to Israel and the Jewish people based on what the Bible says. Because either we're going to believe God's word or we're not going to believe God's word. And every bit of it should be studied. We should be, we should study to show ourselves approved, as is required. And I have had people in speaking events, and these are with conservative groups, who have condemned my support of Israel and the Jewish people. They have accused the Jews of being Khazarians, that they're not real Jews. This is a new This is a new phenomenon that's going on. I've never even heard of it until maybe the last year that this is being banted about. So, you know, here we are again. We're witnessing a rise of anti-Semitism based on the same ancient um, uh, thoughts and beliefs that have never gone away.
Well, here's the, again, I'm from the business world, so I like this expression, bottom line. I would be very, very happy with Christianity and Christians, okay, if they would simply do two things. One, if they would take the words that are in the first century writings that Paul wrote about the olive tree, and it has natural branches and it has wild branches. The wild
Mm-hmm.
branches were grafted in to be added to the natural branches. And yes, there were some that were broken off, some, not all. So if
Mm-hmm.
people could read that and just study that and understand that even the Catholic Church since 1965 says, officially says, in a document out of Vatican II Council, that the
Mm-hmm.
Jews, they say, are our elder brother in the faith of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
point number one. And second of all, that they no longer accept blaming all Jews of all time for the killing of Christ.
Right.
Okay, this is official Catholic doctrine now since 1965.
Yeah. Nostra Aetate. I know that document well, and in fact, it further goes on to state that the church can no longer accuse the Jews or say that the Jews are not in relationship with God.
Exactly, exactly. So if the Jews could be accepted, even if not an elder brother, a cousin, I don't care, but part of the family of people who are trying to be close to the Creator,
Mm-hmm.
and again, according to the Jews, the way we were told to be in the Torah at Mount Sinai, if they could just get there and not be with the second century church fathers who were so anti-Semitic and hatred towards the Jews. So that's number one. And number two, if the Christians could not say, oh, okay, maybe I could accept that, but go further and actually fight the anti-Semitism. I believe that
Absolutely.
until good-hearted Christians, people
Mm-hmm.
of honor and decency and, willing to accept, yeah, I'm going to put the writings of the first century over the writings of the second century because it
Mm-hmm.
changed the whole, game board, if you will. If they would actually fight this injustice that goes on against the Jews, which I know has this long, long history, if more and more people would do that, okay, and actually help the captives come back, our people, our
Mm-hmm.
cousins in Latin America can't leave, come out of Latin
Mm-hmm.
America and come home, which
Mm-hmm.
next time maybe in our podcast we'll get to that. But if they would help with that, and if they would actually just
Mm-hmm.
learn about the anti-Semitism and teach others, okay, and get more and more people as activists, which
Mm-hmm.
my first book is the study guide. My second book, which will come out hopefully in a couple of months, is the activist guide
Mm-hmm.
of how to be an activist. Okay, what are all, I found 50 anti Semitic tropes, 50, okay, of different things people say that aren't true about the Jews, which continues to promote the hatred,
Yeah,
misunderstanding. So
that's right.
the activist guide will have the definitions of all of those and how to, if you confront, if you hear
Mm-hmm.
someone saying them, how you can confront them, not
Right.
them, confront the issue, whatever you want to call it. If they would only get active and actually do something, because
Mm-hmm.
Hashem, God, is not going to hold people, as you say so many times, Laurie. I'm now
Yeah.
quoting you. Is
Yeah.
not going to hold people guiltless
Yeah.
if they
That's
don't do
right.
something about it.
That's
Yeah.
right. Yafa, this has been just amazing as always. And ladies and gentlemen, I want to encourage you to listen to this podcast and listen to it several times and pray about what you are learning, what you are hearing, because there are prophecies after prophecies in Zechariah, he who touches Israel touches the apple of God's eye. That's in chapter 2, verse 8. This is so important that we understand this, and we've got to stop this jealousy, this hatred. And we know that it will, because Isaiah talks about it, where he said in the last days that Ephraim is going to stop being jealous of Judah, and Judah will stop vexing Ephraim, and we will unite together on to wage war against the enemies of Israel. You go back to Obadiah. What did Obadiah say? What did God tell Obadiah? That he was going to wipe out the descendants of Edom in the last days. So we need to, as Christians, Bible-believing Christians, should be studying their Bible to figure out who is Edom and why are they still around from the time of Esau. Why are they still around in the last days? This is so critically important, ladies and gentlemen, and we're going to have Yaffah back with us again next week. So please tune in. And again, Yaffah, I want to thank you. Are there any final comments? How can people learn more about you? You know, when is this book going to be released, and how can they get it?
Okay, so thank you so much. It's going to be an ebook, by the way, because I'm an educator and I just want to educate people. It's going to be available on Kindle, on Amazon, God willing. It's going to be available through givebutter.com, where people will be able to buy it. I'm not going to charge a lot of money, but the money that is paid for the book is going to go to help the B'nai Nusim, those descendants of the Inquisitions, okay, the descendants of the secret Jews, the crypto Jews, because we have a whole organization trying to help these people, especially the ones in Latin America. So I'm finishing the appendices today and tomorrow. The appendices, each chapter is going to have an appendix which identifies articles that go much deeper into the topics of that chapter. Like for the Holocaust, I have A to Z. I have 26 articles that people can read, and they just click the link that they find in the appendix for that chapter. Okay, so that's the whole point of the study guide, is that each chapter is like a summary of that topic, the Middle Ages, the Inquisitions, whatever, and there'll be a lot of different articles that they can click on in the appendix and go to and read details, more details about it. So the study guide, I'm hoping to go into the publishing mode by the middle of this week. And if everything works well, maybe by the end of this week, or certainly by next week, and God willing, please, by the end of January, no later, okay, the ebook, the study guide, will be published and available. And, you know, as soon as I have that information, I'll get it to you. And then I start working on the activist guide, which again will be an ebook, and it will show people how to be an activist, what kind of resources they need to do their activism, and the various kinds of activism that people can do, depending on how much time they have available to do it, and all kinds of stuff like that.
That's fantastic. Fantastic. Yaffah, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this program. We will post this podcast on our website and all of our podcast platforms so that you can share with your family and friends. As PJTN Watchmen, we have a biblical mandate to stand against the ungodly rising Marxist threat that is destroying this nation and other Western nations, threatening our Judeo-Christian values and promoting anti-Semitism. We cannot remain silent. God warned the prophet Ezekiel about the responsibility of the watchman to warn the inhabitants of an enemy that is advancing. And as a watchman, ladies and gentlemen, you can sound the alarm and warn others by simply sharing the podcast with your family and friends. So please share and like the podcast to help sound the alarm in your community. I remind you, Dietrich Bonhoeffer reminded us when he said silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. Don't forget to join us for next week's podcast as we continue this conversation about combating the rise of anti-Semitism and taking back local control of our communities and our children's education. I want to also remind you that if you have not signed up to become a PJTN Watchman, you can help support this mission through our award-winning documentaries and Focus on Israel programs, as well as our programs, other programs like this, just for $20 a month. So go to our website at pjtn.org to watch our programs and listen to our past podcasts. With your generous monthly donation, you can ensure that PJTN remains on the front lines and in the headlines, but we can't do it without your faithful prayers and financial support. So I hope you will prayerfully consider supporting our mission as we educate to activate Jews, Christians, and all people of conscience to stand on the front lines of this all-encompassing war. God bless you, and thank you for all you do on behalf of our Jewish brethren, the State of Israel, and these United States. Thank you again for joining me on this edition of Proclaiming Justice. Please share this podcast with your family and friends. For more information about how you can get involved, please visit our website at pjtn.org. As a PJTN Watchman, you can help us keep up the fight to preserve our freedom for our children and their children for such a time as this.